Hello everyone, welcome to another video. What we'll do in this video is a game analysis of a game that I played against an opponent who was around 100 rating points above me. I am currently around 2050, he was around 2150. This is a 30-minute game, and I play with the white pieces while my opponent has the black pieces. So I start with d4, d5, and this is my normal uh, Queen's Gambit line where I get into the Catalan position. This is a very common position that you might have seen in a lot of my videos. What I try to do is gambit off this pawn, try to get a big center with the other pawn, and also have this Catalan bishop, which constantly pressures the opponent's queen side. Castles, castles, and then my opponent plays b6. So this is the first critical point of the game. My opponent's idea is to develop his bishop here, right, and kind of counter my Catalan bishop. So what I started to think is that if I capture this pawn, what options does my opponent has? So if I capture this pawn and my opponent takes with the queen, I have uh, I can develop my knight with a little bit of a tempo, which is always good for me, right? And his queen has to retreat, which allows me to again capture the center with e4, and I have a very good position. The other option that my opponent has is to capture with the knight, but this again allows e4. He will retreat the knight, and then I might be able to play something like the knight up again. And again, this is a very good center. All my pieces are kind of developed. And the final option that my opponent has is to take with the pawn, which he did. But this is counterintuitive because you're kind of blocking your own bishop if that bishop ever comes to b7, right? So my initial plan kind of worked. So I move ahead, I start developing my knight, and he plays c5. And I don't think this is again a very good move because you are kind of, making your own position a little weak. Like this diagonal is completely open. So I played this natural looking knight to e5 move. In Catalan positions, the knight to e5 move is a very common move. What it does, it sets the knight on this nice square where it attacks some of these advanced squares within black's territory, and the other thing it does in parallel is to open this bishop up, right? So black plays c4. So this is not the right move. What the computer suggests is to play something like takes here. But what I'll do is I'll just take with my queen, and then this pawn is very, very difficult to defend now. So my opponent, does not take. And what my opponent, I think, is trying to do is to lock this diagonal as much as possible and prevent me from opening this up and attacking his rook. So he pushes this pawn, but this is not a very good move because at this point in time, I have something like e4, which again attacks this pawn right away, right? And and the opponent does not have any good option here. For example, if he takes here, right, I can take with my knight, and once this knight moves like this, giving discovered attack to the king, this rook will fall. Even if black decides to take my knight, I take back with my bishop, and there is no good way to protect this rook, right? So so this is something which I think again my opponent saw. So my opponent did not take, and he played something like a6, which I did not think was a very good move again because now I can simply take this pawn, right? Look, this pawn is right now attacked by one, two, three pieces and is protected by only two pieces. So I can take this. What my opponent does is block this pawn because my opponent does not want to allow me this pawn push because it will result in a discovered attack on this rook. So these themes are very common in the Catalan. So people who from the black side who don't see or don't play the Catalan too often always find this a little bit difficult to deal with. So that's why I really like this opening. So my opponent blocks, but this gives me the second pawn in the position, which is the c4 pawn. So now I am clearly 2 pawns up, and 2 pawns up in a classical 30-minute game is a very big advantage. And if uh, and especially when my opponent does not have a lot of counterplay. So this is where my opponent starts pushing on the queen side, and I just play knight to e5. So this was a mistake from my side. I just should have just taken this bishop here, and the queen would have come. This will result with another development with tempo, right? So I should have done that. What I was hoping is that if I play my knight here, if the bishop takes, I can take with my other pawn, and then I'll have these crazy central pawns. Uh, but why would my opponent take, right? My opponent does not want me to undouble my pawns. So I thought that placing the knight here, even if he doesn't take, this knight is so threatening that it should be good for me. But that was not the right move. It allowed my opponent to develop his bishop. But again, this bishop is completely, trapped. Right now, there are uh, two attackers. I have two defenders. But I realized that, very quickly, uh, this bishop may move. This bishop might be able to move somewhere, and my opponent will have another attack in the form of the queen on this pawn. So I played this move, which was again not. I don't think it was the best move. I think the best move here was just bishop to g5, which I did not see. I wanted to just focus on the pieces at the center of the board. So I played this again, not an absolute blunder, but not like the best move either. So now this piece was kind of attacked by 1 2 piece earlier, and now there's a third piece on this. And right now I have 1 2 pieces protecting it. So I add another piece to the defense. So now my opponent has uh, my opponent has 2 pieces, 3 pieces attacking it, and I have 3 pieces defending it. So what my opponent does is just this is a very good move. My opponent now wants to take this pawn, right? But he wants to do that once he has removed my knight. So I think I kind of overlooked this. I played this, which allowed him, which kind of disconnected my queen and my bishop from protecting this pawn, and he took this. Now my knight is kind of undefended um, in the c6 square, and there is potential attack on my queen, which is from this bishop. So I tried to exchange a few pieces to make the situation a little more clear, right? And I got my bishop here out, which I thought was like the other developing move that I should do, and it kind of provides an opportunity to get a discovered attack on the queen. So there are a few more exchanges, right? And this is the position that we end up. So at this point, also I have just a pawn advantage, but my pieces are much better, right? My king is slightly more developed than his king, right? My knight is at a very advanced square, and my rooks can now come into the play with tempo. So he puts some pressure on my knight. What I try to do is to do a counter attack on his rook, and my opponent, of course, sees that. So he blocks with his queen, and I come up with the knight. So this is like my way of utilizing the fact that my opponent is underdeveloped. Because if you think about this, that if my opponent plays what he played here, right? Now you might think this knight is hanging, right? But if you take this knight, this is mate in one, and this is only possible because my opponent is underdeveloped. So my opponent is still pushing pawns, which again I don't understand completely. So I keep developing my pieces, my rooks into open files, right? Making it more and more difficult. I am a pawn up. So, and that pawn, by the way, is this pawn, which is an advanced pawn and a passed pawn, which will be very difficult for my opponent to defend. So again, I'm just asking him, if you want to take, you can take, but then you will be checkmated. Uh, so my opponent tries to solve this issue. Right. So the next move that I made was simply to put my rook in the seventh file. And still my opponent can't take my knight, because if he takes, uh, rook to c8 is almost mate. I can just, yeah. So my opponent, pushes this pawn. So now once this pawn is pushed, right, my opponent is actually threatening takes here. So I need to be a little more careful. So what I do is just to retreat my knight, you know, making way for the other rook to also join in the seventh rank. Uh, so my opponent offers a rook trade. This rook trade is really good for him actually, because if uh, I take his rook, he gets to develop his knight while taking back, right? So I don't want to allow that, of course. So I give a check. Now the king has to move up, and then there's only one place the king can go. Then I get my other rook to the eighth rank also. And now see, these pieces have not moved since the opening. And now how bad these pieces are. So now you basically need to protect your knight with your rook, and your entire position is extremely, extremely passive. So what my opponent does is tries to first remove my knight. So I thought that once my knight is removed, he might want to go here. But still it is extremely, extremely passive. But my opponent does not defend the knight here. He just takes this pawn, and I think he wanted to keep his pieces more active rather than be completely passive with both rooks protecting the knight. So I take the knight. He avoids the rook exchange. So I put my rook behind the other rook. Now the idea is to attack this pawn also. If you don't want to exchange rooks with me, I'll take your pawn. So he moves his rook away again, avoiding the exchange. So I again offer him the exchange of a pair of rooks. He takes, I take. Now his rook comes below to attack my pawns, right? But you have to think constructively here that I am clearly like a whole piece up here. There's no advantage that my opponent has, no counterplay. So I can play a multitude of moves here, play something like this, protecting this pawn, just play my rook here. If he takes, I take this, try to simplify here, and then, with my additional piece, get some pawn advantage and push to win. So that was the idea, but at this point in time, my opponent chose to win. So yeah, I mean, I played this game pretty well, especially in this position. Um, the pawn takes here, I think, kind of set the mood up for the entire game, even though it did not provide me with a lot of advantage in terms of like looking at the computer evaluation. But I think it kind of derailed my opponent's plans, and he was then after that trying to figure out where the game is going, instead of like dictating where it goes. So yeah, I hope you like this video. Uh, See you soon. Bye bye.